Can you share any, you've got a vast experience in this. Can you share any close calls or moments where you were particularly worried for your safety or the safety of your dogs, whether it's Iditarod or not, preferably Iditarod, but, what has really gotten your attention there?
A few examples. I would say probably one of the most notable would be actually not in the Iditarod. It was in the Yukon Quest back in 2011, which the Yukon Quest is another 1,000-mile dog sled race that ran from Whitehorse, Canada to Fairbanks, Alaska. Um, Very challenging course, more in the interior, typically much colder weather conditions. And in that race, we're quite a long ways into it, which is relevant because you become fatigued, you become tired. I have no body fat by that point in the race. And, the dogs are down to efficient traveling weights. But again, they've already traveled 700 miles. So in that process, it's a long story, but try to render it down as much as I can. Basically, we ended up on a river where it was 57 below zero and in about knee deep water. So you would think that rivers would have the decency to freeze when it's that cold out, which they do. And that's the problem, is that if you view the river as a pipe, once it has ice on the top, that ice freezes down and it can actually choke off the river when the bottom of the river swells up. And that water is still flowing. So it'll break through the ice and flow over the top of the ice. And then, of course, it will freeze again. So what happened to me is we were going along ice and it broke through. It was only about half an inch, maybe a little bit more thick. And so it's not like you're going into the whole river, but you're in over your knees, which again, for a dog is, quite a ways up their body. The dogs couldn't push through it. It was too thick for them to push through with their chest and not thick enough for them to climb up on top of without it breaking down. So I, as quickly as I could, disconnected the entire dog team from the sled and just grabbed the whole ball of I think I had about 12 dogs with me at that point in the race. And so I'd step up on the ice and break down, something the size of a sheet of ice about the size of a table. And it would kind of sink down in the ice. My feet would go out from underneath me. I'd fall on my side, step up on the next one, break it down. We did that for a couple hundred yards before we were able to get up where the ice was actually thick enough. Then I went back and had to try to get my sled out of there before it froze because it contained all of our food, all of our equipment of every type. Again, long story short, I finally get all this up to the riverbank off the ice there, and now you got to decide, what do we do now, right? I'm completely soaked. At that temperature, I was wearing every piece of clothing I had. The only thing that I wasn't wearing was a single pair of socks. Um, and I decided that to try to stay and build a fire is not real productive because you can't dry anything out. There's no enclosure to contain the heat. So if you build a fire that's big enough to actually put off warmth, one, you're creating a draft going, feeding that fire. You're creating an artificial wind chill, basically. And secondly, to get close enough to that to actually get heat or to dry anything, you're more likely to melt most of the modern synthetic gear. So decided the best chance for us was to make a run for it. And it was about 45 plus miles to the next checkpoint. Thankfully, I had just camped prior to that, so the team was fairly fresh and well fed and everything. I put on my one dry pair of socks, put garbage bags over my feet, put the wet boots back on, and figured I'd just be running for the next 5 or 6 hours and I could stay warm like that, right? I was in very good shape at that time. And unfortunately, I took off running, and pretty soon my boots froze with the toe pointing pretty much straight up because I'd run and then I'd pedal. I'd push like you would off a skateboard, right? You're standing on your sled, pushing with a foot.
No.
And then it starts cutting off circulation. I tried to cut the boots off. They were too frozen. I cut through all the laces, but everything was frozen together. And that was probably the only time that I'm doing the math in my head, and it's like, it's not looking good to make it out of here. We did eventually make it to the next checkpoint. We were basically a human popsicle, and
Oh my gosh.
took me a little while to thaw out after that one. But took a longer rest than we had planned at the next checkpoint. Tried to get stuff dried out as much as we could, and then continued on the next 300 miles.
Really?
Wow.
So you finished
That's
the
a
race?
story.
Wow.
Yeah, and actually, that race, on the heels of that, I then developed. I didn't know it at the time. I thought I had a hernia because I couldn't, like sitting down, I couldn't lift my foot off the ground without excruciating pain in my stomach. It turns out it was an ulcer, which I would imagine has something to do with trying to do a 1,000-mile race on caffeine, nicotine, and no sleep. It's not the best diet.
Yeah.
I was 23 and pretty ambitious at the time. Fresh out of Olympic level training, so in fairly good shape. That actually ended up being the first dog sled race I ever won. That was just one storm after the next, one terrible situation after the next, and taught me a lot about, if just make it.
Survival of the fittest.
Everybody's having a bad day. You might think you're the only one having to deal with this, but everybody's dealing with something. Just handle the problem as best you can, and let's see where the ships land at the end.